The Galactic Empire, a vast and merciless interstellar dominion, had swept across the stars with an iron grip. From the fringes of space to the core worlds, its influence was suffocating, its rule absolute. Earth, a distant, insignificant blue planet, had long been seen as a backwater by the Empire, a world too primitive and divided to challenge their supremacy. They viewed humanity as a species beneath notice, its wars, its struggles, and its petty squabbles no more consequential than the movements of ants. But that perception was about to change. At the heart of this evolving conflict stood a single innocent human child, a girl named Alara. She was no one special, at least not in the eyes of the Empire, but to Earth she embodied the future. She had been born into a world of uncertainty, raised in the shadow of a fractured planet, yet her bright eyes, her unquenchable curiosity, and her hope for a better tomorrow made her the symbol of all humanity's potential. She was the child of scientists, humanity's vanguard, working on a breakthrough that might finally bring Earth into the galactic fold on its own terms. And it was this very child who would ignite a firestorm across the cosmos. The tragedy unfolded when Alara and her family were on a diplomatic mission to an Imperial-controlled outpost. A simple visit meant to foster understanding between Earth and the Empire, where Earth's brightest minds presented their advancements, their hopes, and their willingness to collaborate. They were naively hopeful. The Empire, on the other hand, dismissed the human delegation with cold indifference. The meeting, despite its promise, turned to farce when a minor miscommunication escalated into a disaster. Alara, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, was shot dead by an Imperial officer. The Empire, as it always did, issued a terse statement. A tragic accident, they claimed, an unfortunate mistake that could be chalked up to an overzealous officer. In their eyes, the death of one insignificant human child was a mere rounding error in the great scheme of things. They believed Earth would grieve and move on as humans always did, lost in the intricacies of their divided politics and fractured alliances. But this time they were wrong. Alara's death was not just the loss of a child, it was a declaration of war. Her parents, devastated by the incomprehensible cruelty, were the first to rally humanity's fractured governments into action. Their grief turned into rage, a fierce anger that spread like wildfire. For years, Earth had struggled beneath the weight of its internal divisions, nations and factions fighting for dominance, each vying for control of dwindling resources and political influence. But this death, this senseless killing, pulled humanity from the edge of the abyss and gave them a singular, unified purpose. As news of the child's death rippled across Earth, the world's leaders gathered, some in mourning, others in fury. Among them was General Liana Reyes, a military strategist who had spent years planning for the impossible, a war with the Empire. Her sharp mind and unyielding resolve had made her one of the most respected figures in the world's defense forces. She had long suspected that the Empire would turn its sights on Earth, and she had prepared for this moment. Now, as the weight of Alara's death bore down upon the planet, it was clear that the time for preparation was over. Liana stood in a dimly lit war room, surrounded by a global coalition of military leaders and diplomats. The room was tense, each person's eyes reflecting the same mixture of grief and fury. The child's death was the spark that ignited their collective will, and Earth's leaders, for the first time in history, were unified under a single cause. Their world had been humbled by the Empire's power, but no more. A single human life had been taken and the Empire had miscalculated. Earth was not a fractured world anymore. It was now a world united by vengeance. "We cannot allow this to stand," Liana spoke, her voice cold and unwavering. Her gaze swept over the room, meeting the eyes of every person there. "The Empire thinks they can erase us, treat us as nothing more than insects. We'll show them just how wrong they are." Her words resonated, filling the room with a palpable sense of purpose. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. The child's death would not go unanswered. And so the wheels of war began to turn. The first steps were swift and calculated. Earth's militaries, long divided and weakened by years of rivalry, now worked as one. The combined forces of the planet's nations rallied, pooling their resources, intelligence, and technology in a unified front. Liana led the charge, her strategic mind cutting through the fog of political discourse. They would not simply retaliate, they would make the Empire regret ever setting its sights on Earth. But even as Earth readied itself for war, the Empire remained blind to the storm gathering in the distance. For the Galactic Empire, Earth was nothing more than a small, inconsequential planet, its citizens weak and disorganized. The Empire's elite, who held the galaxy's reins with cruel authority, saw no need to reconsider their actions. To them, Earth's outcry was nothing more than an insignificant squabble, a minor inconvenience. They could not fathom the depth of the fury their casual cruelty had unleashed. Alera's parents, devastated by the loss, became the faces of the human resistance. They traveled the world, giving impassioned speeches, reminding humanity of what had been lost, of the future that had been stolen from them. Earth's leaders, their heads still reeling from the shock, soon found themselves swept up in the momentum of this movement. This was no longer just a political response, it was personal. Every human on Earth now carried the weight of Alera's death on their shoulders, and they would not rest until justice was served. The Empire, oblivious to the storm it had created, continued its operations, expanding its grip on neighboring systems. Yet something was shifting. The first signs of resistance began to appear. Sabotage on Imperial outposts, coordinated strikes by underground human factions. These small victories, though largely unacknowledged, spread hope like wildfire. Earth was not as weak as the Empire had assumed. Earth was a sleeping giant, and the death of a child had awakened it. The fate of humanity now lay in the hands of General Reyes and the growing resistance. She knew that the coming conflict would not be easy. The Empire was vast, its technology unparalleled, its forces relentless. But she also knew something the Empire had underestimated: the unyielding will of a united humanity. Earth would fight not because it was easy but because it was the only choice left. And so, the first chapter of humanity's war began, not in the cold void of space, but in the heart of a grieving world, where the death of one child sparked the beginning of a galaxy-shattering conflict. The stage was set for an epic struggle, one that would shape the future of the galaxy and prove that even the smallest spark could ignite the most devastating of fires. The days following Alera's death were a blur of grief, outrage, and a surge of uncontainable resolve. Earth's governments, long divided by petty rivalries and centuries of mistrust, had quickly formed an unprecedented alliance, bound together by the singular desire for revenge. It was clear now they had no choice but to fight. No longer could humanity cower beneath the heel of the Empire. They would face their tormentors not with the weakness of submission, but with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose. General Liana Reyes stood at the center of it all, her mind sharp, calculating, and filled with the singular purpose of revenge. Her rise to prominence had been slow, methodical. She had studied the Empire's tactics, analyzed their weaknesses, and prepared for this day long before Alera's death. But even she had not anticipated the speed at which the world would unite in the face of tragedy. This was no longer just a matter of strategy, it was personal. It was about every life lost to the Empire's cruelty. It was about Alera. In the early days of the conflict, the Empire's forces underestimated the human response. Earth's military was small by comparison, fragmented by centuries of territorial disputes and a lack of unified leadership. But in a world on the brink of extinction, humans could be surprisingly resourceful. Liana knew this better than anyone. She had been a commander during previous skirmishes and crises, and she understood how to rally the troops, to turn despair into determination. As human forces gathered, she pushed them hard, guiding them through a series of covert operations that would test both their ingenuity and their loyalty. The first strike came swiftly. A coordinated assault on an Imperial data center, buried deep within one of their outer colonies. The Empire had assumed that their remote facilities would be safe, shielded by distance and their technological dominance. They were wrong. Earth's forces, now working as one, infiltrated the complex with surgical precision. It wasn't a battle fought with overwhelming firepower. It was a quiet war of stealth, of hacking into Imperial systems, of turning their own weapons against them. The mission was a resounding success, crippling the Empire's communications in the region and sending a message. Earth was not as defenseless as they thought. It wasn't just the military that fought, though. Across the planet, ordinary people, from engineers to former soldiers, rallied to the cause. The resistance grew, each victory fueling the fire of rebellion. In the underground, human hackers, once dismissed as criminals, became war heroes. They infiltrated Imperial networks, releasing data that exposed the Empire's darkest secrets, from their oppressive regimes on conquered worlds to their experiments on subjugated species. Earth was no longer fighting for survival, it was fighting for its soul. Among those rising to prominence was Captain Juno Anders, a former fighter pilot who had once served under the Imperial forces. She was a defector, having seen the horrors the Empire was willing to inflict on those who dared to resist. Juno was a woman of few words, but her actions spoke volumes. She led a small fleet of human ships, strategically outmaneuvering Imperial forces with cunning and daring. Her skill in space combat was unmatched, and it was this expertise that allowed Earth's forces to take down Imperial supply lines, disrupt trade routes, and cripple their logistical operations. Juno's hatred for the Empire ran deep. It was not just about the wars she had fought in, but the personal loss she had endured. Her family had been massacred by the Empire's forces when they had been labeled rebels in a far-off system. The rage she had bottled up for years now flowed freely in every engagement. She was driven by a singular purpose: to destroy the Empire piece by piece. And with each victory her resolve grew stronger. The Empire, meanwhile, remained largely blind to the growing resistance. Their initial arrogance, born from centuries of unchallenged rule, led them to believe Earth was incapable of mounting a meaningful challenge. They sent small, token forces to respond to what they saw as insignificant skirmishes. But these underestimations would come to haunt them. Each mission, each victory only increased Earth's strength. The Empire's reliance on their technological superiority left them vulnerable to the resourcefulness of humanity. General Reyes watched with a careful eye as Earth's forces began to outmaneuver the Empire at every turn. She understood that the war was not just about firepower. It was about unity, about fighting for something greater than one's own life. As the resistance grew, so too did the sense of shared purpose. Earth, a fractured world united by grief, had become a force to be reckoned with. But Reyes knew that they had only just begun. The Empire would not remain passive forever. Soon they would send their full might to crush humanity once and for all. Earth's forces had to be ready for what was coming. The next phase of the war would be even more dangerous and the stakes would be higher. The Empire's wrath would be swift and brutal, but Reyes believed in the resilience of the human spirit. They had already proven that they could endure. Now it was time to prove they could win. The final test would come soon. A strike against one of the Empire's largest fleet stations, one of the most heavily fortified in their arsenal. If Earth could succeed here, it would be a turning point, a blow to the Empire that would send shockwaves through their entire military apparatus. It was a risky operation, one that required precision and flawless execution. Failure was not an option. The stakes were higher than ever and the cost of failure would be catastrophic. Juno Anders, her fleet now positioned on the outskirts of Imperial space, prepared for the most dangerous mission of her life. She knew the odds were against them, but in her heart she felt something she hadn't in years: hope. She wasn't just fighting for revenge anymore. She was fighting for a future where humanity could stand on equal ground with the stars. The mission would take everything they had and perhaps more. But in the cold expanse of space, amidst the glittering stars that had long seemed so distant, a new message was being written. Earth had awakened. And with every battle fought, every life lost, they were moving closer to their ultimate goal. The war had only just begun, but one thing was clear: humanity would no longer be the Empire's prey. They would be its executioners. With the fleet ready, Reyes and Anders exchanged a final look before heading into the unknown. The Empire's ships were large, powerful, but the thing the Empire had never accounted for was the will of a united species, fueled by the death of a child. That will was their greatest weapon, and it would be the Empire's undoing. The final assault was approaching, and the weight of the mission pressed heavily on General Leona Reyes. Earth's forces had gathered every resource, every piece of knowledge they had accumulated in their long, brutal struggle against the Empire. They had become a fighting force unlike anything the galaxy had seen, a relentless, resourceful, and united enemy. But now it was time for the decisive blow. One final strike against the Empire's heart. The target was the Imperial Fleet Station in the Venoris system, a fortress that housed the Empire's most powerful warships. Its destruction would cripple the Empire's ability to project power across the galaxy, sending a message that even their mightiest war machines were not invulnerable. But the station was heavily guarded, surrounded by layers of defense and protected by a fleet of ships capable of annihilating anything that dared approach. It was a mission that should have been impossible. But nothing was impossible anymore. Not after everything they had lost. Captain Juno Anders had volunteered for the mission. There was no one else she would trust with such a critical task. She had fought against the Empire before, but this time was different. This time the war wasn't about survival or retaliation. It was about destruction. The destruction of an empire that had taken everything from them. Her hands gripped the controls of her fighter as she prepared for the assault, her mind focused and sharp. The memories of her fallen family, the years of rage and sorrow, had given her purpose. The empire would burn and she would be the one to light the match. Reyes, watching from the war room aboard the command ship, felt the weight of every decision she had made. She had been a soldier long enough to know the cost of war, the sacrifices that would be required. And yet, with each new victory, with each new loss, her belief in the mission only grew stronger. She had seen Earth unite in ways no one had ever thought possible, and now she watched as that unity took form in this final strike. There was no turning back. The war had started with the death of one child, but it would end with the destruction of an empire. The plan was simple in concept but staggering in its execution. A fleet of human ships, each armed with experimental technology developed in the wake of their early victories, would breach the station's outer defenses. Once inside, a team of elite soldiers would infiltrate the station's core and plant explosives that would ensure its total destruction. Every minute would count. Every second was critical. The fleet moved out of Earth's atmosphere, their engines a chorus of defiance. Juno's ships led the charge, cutting through the darkness of space with pinpoint precision. The Empire station came into view, its silhouette an imposing fortress, bathed in the cold light of distant stars. As they neared the station, the first line of defense activated. Waves of Imperial fighters surged forward, their sleek designs cutting through space like predators. But Juno and her squadron met them head-on, engaging in a dance of death that would decide the fate of their world. In the cockpit, Juno's mind was razor-sharp. Each maneuver was deliberate, each shot calculated. Her fighter streaked across the void, weaving in and out of enemy fire, her heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and fury. She was no longer fighting for herself, for revenge, or even for her fallen comrades. She was fighting for humanity, for the future they had all sacrificed for. She pressed the attack, knowing that every Imperial ship she downed brought them one step closer to victory. Back on the command ship, Reyes watched the battle unfold. The initial skirmish had been intense, but the human forces were relentless. It was as if the combined grief and rage of the entire planet had coalesced into a single unstoppable force. The Imperial fleet, initially confident in its superiority, was now struggling to cope with the speed and unpredictability of their human adversaries. But the battle was far from over. As Juno's squadron engaged the Imperial fighters, Earth's strike force began to breach the station's outer defenses. They fought through swarming blasts and the cold, mechanical precision of the Empire's soldiers, pushing deeper into the station's heart. Time was running out. The explosives had to be placed, and they had to leave before the station's internal security triggered a full lockdown. The team, led by Sergeant Elijah Kane, a grizzled veteran of many campaigns, fought their way through the station's labyrinthine corridors. Every step was a fight for survival, every corner turned a potential death trap. Kane's squad had been handpicked for this mission, each member a survivor of the countless battles that had preceded this moment. Together they had honed their skills in the fires of war, and now they would face their ultimate test. As they reached the core of the station, Kane gave the order to plant the explosives. The countdown had begun. But just as they were preparing to leave, the worst-case scenario occurred. The station's central security system activated, sealing the team inside and triggering an all-out defense protocol. The walls began to close in, and the doors slammed shut with a deafening roar. Kane's voice echoed through the comms as he barked orders, trying to maintain control. It was a race against time now. Outside, Juno and her squadron were engaged in a brutal dogfight with the Imperial fleet. The station's defenders were now fully mobilized, sending wave after wave of ships to stop the humans from completing their mission. Juno's heart raced as she saw the timer ticking down, knowing her comrades were still inside, fighting for their lives. If they didn't finish the job, the entire mission would be in vain. Reyes, her eyes fixed on the battle unfolding before her, knew there was no way to contact the strike team now. They were on their own. She gripped the armrests of her seat, her breath steady despite the rising tension. She had led humanity to this point, and now it was up to those on the front lines to finish it. With the final moments closing in, Juno made a split-second decision that would either win them the war or doom them all. She broke off from the dogfight, sending her ship into a high-speed dive toward the station. She would create the diversion, lead the last charge, and give the strike team a chance to escape. She wasn't sure if she would make it out, but that was the nature of war. It was all about sacrifices, about what they were willing to give for the chance to win. The explosion that followed rocked the entire station, the shockwave sending tremors through space. The fleet station erupted in a blinding flash of light, its once imposing structure torn apart by the very force that had been used to fuel its power. As the dust settled in the cold vacuum of space, Earth's forces knew they had won. But victory came at a cost. Juno's ship had disappeared into the chaos, her fate uncertain. As the surviving forces regrouped, the Empire's once unshakable hold on the galaxy began to crumble. The war had taken its toll, and now Earth stood as a force to be reckoned with. Reyes watched as her forces made their retreat, the mission complete. She had led them to this moment, but the true price of victory had yet to be fully understood. In the silence of space, the Galactic Empire was no longer the unstoppable power it once was. And for the first time in the history of humanity's struggle, there was a real chance for peace. A peace earned through and sealed with the destruction of an empire that had never known true resistance. In the aftermath of the destruction, the galaxy was left in silence. The Empire, once a monolithic force that controlled vast stretches of space, now found itself on the brink of collapse. The ruins of its once mighty fleet station drifted like debris in the cold void, a reminder of the power that had been shattered. The explosion had not just crippled their military, it had shattered their confidence, their certainty of invulnerability. But victory, as it always does, came at a cost. General Liana Reyes stood alone in the command room, the glow of the star maps casting shadows on her face. She hadn't moved in hours, her eyes tracing the lines of light that represented their forces, now scattered across the galaxy. The battle had been won, yes, but the war, she knew, was far from over. The Empire was no longer the same beast it had once been. Its leaders, weakened by defeat and internal power struggles, would undoubtedly strike back, perhaps with greater ferocity than before. Reyes had known the cost of victory, but now she felt the weight of the toll it had taken on her and those who had followed her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. She could feel the presence of Captain Juno Anders even before she spoke. The two had forged an unspoken bond over the years, a bond built on mutual respect, shared sacrifices, and the quiet understanding that they both bore the same burden. "You did it," Juno said, her voice steady but laced with a weariness that came from 1,000 battles fought, both physical and emotional. Reyes nodded, her expression unreadable. "We did it. But the cost, it's more than I thought. It's never just one mission, one victory. There's always more to do. Always another fight waiting in the shadows." Juno leaned against the wall, folding her arms across her chest. She had seen the same things, the lives lost, the unrelenting toll of war. She had fought side by side with those she'd watched fall. Some days, it felt as though she had nothing left to give. But then she'd look at the survivors, the ones who had stood strong in the face of insurmountable odds, and she found the strength to keep going. "We'll rebuild," Juno said, her voice quieter now. "It's not over, but we have a chance. We have a chance to finally put an end to the Empire's reign of terror. We've given the galaxy hope." Reyes didn't answer immediately. She stared at the war maps again, her mind racing with the next steps. The Empire would regroup, reorganize, and retaliate, but they would never again be the unstoppable force they once were. The spark of resistance had spread too far, too fast. Earth had become the symbol of defiance. It wasn't just the death of one child that had ignited this war. It was the belief that they could fight back, that they could break the chains that bound them to the Empire's cruelty. "We'll need to be careful," Reyes finally said. "The Empire is wounded, but its wrath will be unpredictable. We have to strike when they least expect it. We need to finish what we started before the darkness rises again." Juno's eyes hardened, a fire returning to her gaze. "We will. But we'll need every ally we can get. Earth might be the heart of this rebellion, but there are other systems, other people who are waiting for us to lead them. We can't win this alone. Reyes turned to face her, the weight of the galaxy's future resting on her shoulders. I know. We'll need to build a coalition. The Empire controls too much, has too many resources. But they've underestimated us. They've underestimated humanity. Juno stepped forward, her expression fierce. Then let's show them what happens when they do. The two stood in silence for a long moment, the enormity of the task ahead settling in. The rebellion had only begun to gain traction, but it had already spread far beyond Earth's borders. The galaxy, once subjugated by the Empire's iron fist, was beginning to stir, to awaken. Systems once held in fear had seen the light of humanity's resistance and were now questioning their loyalty to the Empire. Reyes and Juno knew the time had come to seize that momentum. It would take time, strategy, and cunning, but they had already proven that the impossible was possible. The Empire could no longer crush them with the ease it once did. They had become a threat. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Communications were sent across the galaxy, reaching out to systems that had long lived under the Empire's oppression. There was talk of an alliance, a united front that would stand against the Empire, not as scattered factions but as a singular force. The promise of freedom was a powerful motivator, and word of Earth's triumph had begun to stir embers of rebellion in even the most seemingly loyal sectors. But as the resistance grew, so did the danger. Imperial fleets, once scattered and disorganized, began to regroup, their leaders desperate to restore their fallen glory. The Empire had many ships, countless resources, and an unwavering will to maintain control. Earth had only one advantage: the unity forged in the heat of loss, the collective will of a species that had been pushed to the brink and refused to back down. One night, as the rebellion's plans were set in motion, Reyes and Juno stood on the observation deck of the flagship, staring out into the stars. The weight of the moment hung in the air between them. "It's not just about us anymore, is it?" Juno said, her voice softer now. Reyes met her gaze, her eyes reflecting a depth of understanding. "No. It's about everyone who's ever suffered under the Empire's rule. It's about the future we'll leave behind." Juno nodded, her expression firm. "Then let's make sure it's a future worth fighting for." And with that, the final phase of the war began. Not in the depths of space, but in the hearts of every human who believed that they could, once and for all, defeat the galaxy's greatest tyrant. The rebellion had started as a fight for survival, but it had become something far greater. The death of a single child had lit a fire that could not be extinguished, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The war, now fully ignited, had taken on a new rhythm. It was no longer a series of skirmishes. It was an all-out struggle for the future of the galaxy. Earth's forces, emboldened by their successes and united by a shared, searing loss, had become a driving force of rebellion. But as their power grew, so did the complexity of the challenge. The Empire, despite its losses, was not broken. It was angry, desperate, and driven by the one thing that could never be underestimated: fear. General Liana Reyes sat at the head of the War Council, her face stoic, her eyes filled with an intensity that matched the task at hand. Earth's coalition forces had made significant progress, forging alliances with former slaves and oppressed systems that had long been under the Empire's thumb. Each victory, each world freed from the Empire's control, fueled the fire of rebellion. Yet for all their progress, Reyes knew that they were not yet close to achieving the final victory. There were too many unknowns. The Empire still controlled vast swaths of the galaxy, and its leaders were regrouping, preparing to unleash their wrath on the growing rebellion. The cost of failure was higher than ever. Beside her, Captain Juno Anders stood, arms crossed, her mind miles away, focused on the tactical realities of the war. Juno had become a symbol of the rebellion, her name whispered with reverence by soldiers and civilians alike. Her fleet had struck a significant blow to the Empire, and her leadership had been instrumental in turning the tide. But as the war escalated, the weight of the responsibility began to wear on her. The once clear path to victory was now clouded with uncertainty, and she could feel the burden pressing down on her shoulders. "We have to hit them hard now," Juno said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. "If we wait too long, the Empire will have time to consolidate. Their retaliation will be even more brutal." Reyes nodded, her mind already turning to the next steps. "We know. But we can't afford to attack recklessly. If we strike too soon, we risk playing into their hands. We need to weaken them, disrupt their power centers, create confusion, make them fight on multiple fronts. We can't give them a chance to regroup. Her words hung in the air, the implications heavy. The Empire's remaining strongholds were formidable, and its leaders would not go down without a fight. Reyes's mind raced with strategies, each one more dangerous than the last. But there was no time for hesitation. If they didn't act soon, the momentum they had worked so hard to build would fade. Outside the war room, the galaxy was changing. No longer were the people of Earth isolated, fighting alone. The message had spread. Hope had taken root in the hearts of those who had been oppressed, those who had been forgotten. The Empire's grip on the galaxy was weakening, but it still held power over many worlds. The rebellion needed to take one more critical step: unite these fractured systems into a true coalition, one that could challenge the Empire's might on all fronts. But unity would not come easily. The systems they sought to liberate had suffered for so long that trust was in short supply. Many had lived under the Empire's rule for generations, their loyalties deeply ingrained. There were those who feared the rebellion would be no different, another empire in the making. And then there were the forces within the rebellion itself, factions that disagreed on how the war should be fought. Some wanted to continue with covert strikes and sabotage, while others, like Juno, felt that only a decisive military campaign would end the war once and for all. The decision weighed heavily on Reyes, who knew that the rebellion's unity depended on her ability to bring these voices together. "We need to prove to them that we can be the leaders they've been waiting for," she said, her tone resolute. "That we're not just fighting to survive, we're fighting to build something better, something that can stand the test of time." Juno's gaze softened, and for the briefest moment, there was a flicker of understanding between them. It was not just the galaxy they were fighting for. It was for the future of their people, for the generations that would come after them. It was for the dream of a galaxy free from tyranny, where peace wasn't just a word whispered in the darkness, but a reality for every living being. "I'll reach out to the other systems," Juno said, breaking the silence. "We've earned their trust. But we'll need more than just military victories. We need to show them that we're not like the Empire. That when we win, we will rebuild." Reyes considered her words carefully. "And that's what we need to focus on. Rebuilding. If we simply destroy the Empire without offering something better, we'll be no different from the forces we're fighting against. We need to show the galaxy that there's hope." The plan began to take shape, slowly but with increasing clarity. It would be a campaign of both military action and diplomacy, a balancing act between showing strength and offering the chance for something new. The rebellion could not afford to repeat the mistakes of the past, where the ends justified the means. They had to be different. They had to be better. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, strategies, and desperate negotiations. Juno worked tirelessly, traveling from system to system, convincing leaders to join their cause. Meanwhile, Reyes oversaw the coordination of the military efforts. They would hit the Empire's critical supply lines, their communication hubs, and their military outposts. It would be a campaign of precision: strike fast, strike hard, and disappear before the Empire could retaliate. But just as their preparations reached a fever pitch, an unexpected event threw everything into chaos. A message from the heart of Imperial space arrived, transmitted on a frequency no one had expected. It was a direct communication from the Empire's new ruler, an individual whose name was whispered in the darkest corners of the galaxy, a figure known only as the Supreme Inquisitor. The message was simple but chilling. "You have stirred the hornet's nest, and now the Empire will come for you all. No more hiding. No more running. The galaxy will kneel to the will of the Empire, or it will burn." The message was a declaration of war, but it also revealed something even more troubling. The Empire was prepared for the rebellion in ways they hadn't anticipated. It was no longer a matter of fighting a fractured, dying regime. The Empire had found new strength, new leaders, and they were coming with everything they had. Reyes stood still, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The rebellion had just become much more dangerous and much more urgent. The war was no longer just about fighting for freedom. It was about survival. "We're going to need every ally we can find," Reyes said, her voice quiet but fierce. "And we're going to need to be smarter than ever before." Juno's eyes hardened. "Then we show them what happens when you push humanity to the brink. We fight back." And so, the war entered a new phase. one that would require more than just bravery, more than just military strength. The rebellion had to outthink the Empire, outmaneuver its power at every turn. The galaxy would watch, and in the end, it would decide who would rule: the Empire or the collective will of the free people who had chosen to fight for something greater. The rebellion's next move had to be swift. The Supreme Inquisitor's threat had sent ripples through the ranks, but it was not just fear that now held the galaxy in suspense. It was the unyielding resolve that had hardened in the hearts of those who fought alongside General Reyes and Captain Juno Anders. Earth's rebellion was no longer a scattered resistance. It had become a galaxy-wide struggle, a fight for freedom that could not and would not be undone. Reyes paced the command center, her steps measured, her eyes fixed on the tactical maps that stretched across the walls. The Empire's retaliation was inevitable, but she needed to anticipate its every move. The Supreme Inquisitor had positioned himself as the ultimate weapon of the Empire, a shadow that had haunted the galaxy for years. His ruthlessness was legendary, and his intellect matched his cruelty. If they were to defeat him, they had to outsmart him, and time was running out. Juno stood across from her, looking over the same maps, but her focus was on the broader picture. The rebellion had come a long way, and now they stood on the precipice of something far more dangerous than they had ever faced. The Empire was no longer a monolithic, faceless entity. It had a leader who understood the stakes, a leader who would stop at nothing to crush their rebellion. Reyes, Juno spoke, breaking the silence. We can't keep waiting for them to come to us. We have to strike first, force them to react. We need to take the fight to their doorstep. Reyes stopped in her tracks, her eyes locking with Juno's. There was an intensity in her gaze, a conviction that had only grown stronger with every battle fought. I agree, but this has to be more than just an offensive. We need to destabilize them, take out their command structures, hit their fleet where it hurts. If we can force them into a position where they have to choose between defending their heartlands and their outer colonies, we'll have a chance. Juno's expression hardened as she nodded. The stakes had never been higher, and yet there was something in her that welcomed the challenge. They had already defied the odds, and now they had to do it again. We'll need to use every resource we've got. The fleet is ready, but we can't risk spreading ourselves too thin. The general's lips pressed into a thin line. I know. We'll have to rely on our allies. Systems like Drova, Linta, and Varsa are key. They'll provide the cover we need, but we can't afford to lose any more time. The Empire is already regrouping. Every minute we waste, they get stronger. Juno's eyes shifted to the holographic display, a sharpness in them that only came from years of experience. We'll need to move quickly. If we strike now, we can divide their forces, maybe even force a split between their military and their civilian leadership. A long pause followed. Reyes knew that their next move would be their most daring yet. It was one thing to fight a war of attrition. It was another to break the spine of the enemy with a single decisive blow. The problem was that even with all their preparations, they were still outnumbered. The Empire controlled too much territory, too many resources, and its fleets were vast and powerful. If they miscalculated, they risked annihilation. But that was the nature of war. Risks, calculated or not, were inevitable. Reyes's mind flicked back to Earth, to the lives lost in the opening gambit of this war, to the child whose death had ignited a firestorm. They couldn't back down now. She couldn't back down. She owed it to them to see this through, to fight for the future that the Empire had stolen. We move in 20 hours, she finally said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of 1,000 decisions. Prepare the fleet for an assault on the Empire's primary logistics hub at Talvor Station. We hit them hard, fast, and then retreat before they can retaliate. We will cripple their ability to resupply their outer fleets. Juno's eyes narrowed and her lips curled into a small smile. A strike at their heart. I like it. Reyes's expression softened just slightly. It was rare for her to show anything but resolve, but in that moment she allowed herself the briefest glimpse of confidence. She turned to the tactical screen, a dark star field filling the display as ships and planets were mapped out in intricate detail. They had fought tooth and nail for this moment. Each victory, each loss had led them here to this fragile turning point in the war. The plan was simple but dangerous. The rebellion would make its move just as the Empire's forces had begun to regroup. Talvor Station, a massive logistical hub, was the lifeblood of their supply lines. The Empire's fleet would be crippled without it. If they succeeded, it would send a clear message. The Empire was no longer invulnerable. The clock was ticking. There was no turning back now. As Juno left to oversee the fleet preparations, Reyes stood alone in the command center, the stars outside seeming to pulse with an ominous rhythm. The Supreme Inquisitor was out there somewhere, no doubt preparing his own strategy. A shadow of his reputation loomed over them, but Reyes didn't flinch. She had faced shadows before and she had always emerged victorious. But this time it was different. The Empire was no longer just an enemy. It was a force that sought to break everything they had built, everything they had fought for. And in that moment Reyes knew one thing for certain. This battle, this war would decide the future of the galaxy. Earth had already made its mark. It had ignited a spark that could not be extinguished, and now the rebellion was going to finish what they had started. But the question was, could they survive long enough to see it through? The days ahead would test them all in ways they hadn't yet imagined. But as Reyes stood alone looking at the stars, she knew that there was no turning back. The rebellion was more than a military campaign. It was a movement, a symbol that humanity would never be crushed, never be erased from the face of the galaxy. The war would continue, but Earth's people had already shown their strength. Now it was time to show the Empire that their reign was over.